On Friday, I walked into the church about 6 o'clock in the evening, sat back there in that corner in the rocking chair for the last hour of the Good Friday prayer vigil. That vigil goes on throughout the day on Good Friday with at least one person being in the church from 7 in the morning until 7 at night. And during that last hour, I had intended just to sit in the rocking chair and read one of the devotional books that had been placed out on the table next to the chair. I thought I would do that in preparation for the Good Friday service that would begin at 7. But when I sat down and I looked up here at the altar, I just couldn't stop gazing at the starkness of the very rough, large wooden cross that was balanced on the bare altar. The cross, by the way, was made by Glenn Jacobson, who's sitting back there. But this cross balanced on that altar was something that just completely caught my attention. The altar had been stripped of all of the colorful hangings that we usually have on it. It had been stripped of that on Maundy Thursday night. So it only showed the smooth, dark wood of which the altar is made. And it was quite a contrast to the roughness of the raw boards that had been nailed together to form the large cross. On top of the cross was a crown of thorns. I mean, a real crown of thorns, the kind that could prick your finger and draw blood. What was perhaps most striking was that the bare altar, the rough-hewn cross, and the deadly-looking crown of thorns was all that was left up here. There wasn't anything else. No candles. Cross was on the wall was veiled in black. This cross was veiled in black. And so all I saw, was that cross and that crown of thorn and that altar. And what struck me was that together they created a scene of what life looks like when life is stripped bare. But now look at the beauty all around. Look at the altar with the beautiful white silk hangings and the fragrant lilies that draw your attention to the wall and the cross that's no longer veiled. And look at this. Look at the colorful flowers that you yourselves brought and placed here. What a different look this is from the way it looked Friday night. What a difference a few days make. That's the good news we proclaim each Easter. The difference that a few days make. It's the good news that even when the death-dealing events of our life lay our lives bare, life has not ended, but it has only changed. It has only been transformed. We see this good news in its most explicit form in the experiences that the early disciples had of the risen Lord. Because after the bleakness of that day when Jesus was executed, the day that they experienced both the death of someone they loved dearly and also the death of all their hopes and all their dreams, after the end of everything on that Friday, on Sunday, they began to have a series of experiences that changed their lives. This morning, the gospel reading from Mark tells of Mary Magdalene and another Mary and of some of the disciples and their experience that they had. On other Sundays during the 50 days of Easter, we'll hear more about the experience of all the disciples. We'll hear about Peter and Thomas. We'll hear about two unnamed disciples who had left Jerusalem and were on a road to another city, to the place of Emmaus. And in this morning's reading from Paul's first letter to the Christians in Corinth, we hear about a whole list of experiences that people had of the risen Lord, including the risen Lord's appearance to more than 500 men and women at one time. 2,000 years later, we may not understand what form their experiences of the risen Lord actually took. We may not really get it from our ability to put together what they told us and what we know of life itself. But we do know this. We know that whatever the nature of their experience was, it was powerful enough to change absolutely everything about their lives. How do we know this? We know this because the fear and the disillusionment that led them to desert Jesus just before and just after the crucifixion was transformed into a conviction that he had risen, into a conviction that they were continuing to experience his living presence, a conviction that drove their fears and their disillusionment away, a conviction that his living presence was still with them, that was strong enough for them to be willing to be executed themselves rather than to deny their experience. You aren't willing to go to a cross yourself or to be beheaded yourself just on a whim. So whether we understand the experience or not, a whole bunch of people had some kind of experience of the risen Lord that changed their lives. What a difference a few days did make for them. Now, one thing we forget sometimes is that those first disciples had neither the benefit nor the hindrance of 2,000 years of teaching about what the resurrection is and meant. They were neither enlightened nor encumbered by all of that information that we carry around in our heads. All that stuff we either agree with or don't agree with. They didn't have that. The experiences they described were just that. They were descriptions of their own experience, said in the best way they could say it, painted to make a picture that would be as real to people as possible, an experience that was beyond anything they had ever experienced before. They were simply able to tell their experience of what it meant to be absolutely transformed by the power of the risen Lord. Perhaps the rest of us would do well to follow their lead. To follow their lead, to look for those experiences of that transforming power that we still have today. And the first place we need to look for this transforming power is whenever we find ourselves needing to die to a particular way of living life. Because every time we die to one way of being in the world, we can be sure that the opportunity to rise to a new way is close at hand. It might take longer than just 3 days, but still the opportunity and the power to claim the opportunity of new life is always available to each one of us. What the death and resurrection of Jesus teaches us is that the whole pattern of life is a pattern of dying and rising again, leaving one thing behind and growing into something else. These ways of dying and rising are as many and varied as the people sitting in this room. For one, it may be dying to the security of the home in which you've lived all of your lives and rising again to a new place that you didn't really want to move to. For someone else, it may be dying to what it means to have the freedom of being a couple without children in order to live into a different kind of freedom, a freedom to choose what is necessary for the well-being of your child. For someone else, it may be dying to the hope of finding fulfillment in the job you have and rising to the realization that there's another job you need to do. For still another, it may be dying to the good health you've enjoyed most of your life And rising to what the weakness of a body can teach you about the strength of your spirit. For yet another, it may be dying to the conviction that you can go it alone in order to rise to the reality that every single one of us needs someone sometime. This list could go on and on and on. And if you think about it long enough, I feel sure that each and every one of you can locate something in your lives that you either need to die to or are in the process of dying to. You may have chosen not to look at what you need to die to. You may have chosen not to see or to feel or to let it hit your hearts and minds the kind of dying that you are doing right now. Because such denial is always a part of death. The act of dying to anything, whether it's big or small, is never very pleasant. We all want to hang on to what we've got, whether what we've got's working or not. But Easter tells us the truth about all of these kinds of death. And the truth is this, that no matter what we have to die to, the power of a new and transformed life, the same power that we see in the risen Christ, that power is greater still, greater than any kind of death we ever experience. There will always be times in every life when what we see before us looks more like the starkness of that altar and cross and crown of thorns on Good Friday. It'll just come. It's a part of life. If you haven't had it yet, I'm pleased for you. But we all have it at some point, in some ways, usually many times over, regardless of what we're struggling with. That there are times in our lives when life looks more like that kind of bareness and starkness. But what today reminds us of, it's just a few days. Maybe not 24-hour days like we like to count them. Maybe it's counted more in years. But the promise of Easter is that no death of any kind ever has dominion over us. Life always rules in the end. And when we find ourselves in times that feel more like death than life, that feel more like Good Friday than Easter, we can be sure that the power of the risen Lord is already at work in us, whether we see it or not, working to make a difference. Hallelujah, Christ is risen. You know what this is? Hallelujah.